My name is Nicole, and I will be talking about person-centered therapy. So first we're going to talk about the two superstar founders. So really there's only one, and it's Carl Rogers. However, his daughter did take some of his theories and expand on it, and I thought it was just very important to mention her as well because she did also have a really big impact and influence with this theory. So first we're going to talk about Carl Ransom Rogers. He was born in 1902 and passed away in 1987. He was the first to study the counseling process in depth by analyzing the transcripts of actual therapy sessions, and he was the first clinician to conduct major studies on psychotherapy using quantitative methods. He was a major spokesperson for humanistic psychology, led a life that reflected the ideas he developed for half a century. He was also a courageous pioneer who was 50 years ahead of his time and has been waiting for us to catch up. He was quite the revolutionary, who both contributed to the theory development and whose influence continues to shape counseling practice today. He's also known as the father of psychotherapy research. During his last 15 years of life, Rogers applied the person-centered approach to the world by training policymakers, leaders, and groups in conflict. He was also nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So next we have his daughter, Natalie Rogers, who was born in 1928 and 2015. So, she was not the founder of the person-centered therapy, but she was a pioneer in the field of person-centered expressive arts therapy. She expanded on her father's theory of creativity by using expressive arts to enhance personal growth for individuals and groups. Her work evolved from what she felt was lacking in her father's theory, which I think is something really cool to know. Carl always took a very realistic view of his theory. He loved his theory and he thought it was a great theory, but he also knew that there's always room for improvement. So when his daughter Natalie came in and talked to him about growing and wanting to do this person-centered expressive arts therapy, he was all for it and he was on board and super, super supportive of her, which I think is really awesome. Person-centered expressive art therapy has a variety of forms, such as movement, painting, sculpting, music, writing, and improvisation, all done in a supportive setting to facilitate growth and healing. She also facilitated many workshops in the United States, England, Hong Kong, Latin America, Russia, and South Korea. She also taught a 6-week expressive arts certificate program at Sophia University in Northern California. And here's the lovely Carl Ransom Rogers and the beautiful Natalie Rogers. Next, we're going to talk about what was going on in the world. So during the 1940s, 1950s is when this theory was kind of coming about, and I feel like normally during that time people kind of think of the war, like World War II, the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor, and all those very sad, kind of depressing times. So I wanted to bring some light to that decade and talk about some positive things that were going on around this time, besides obviously the theory at hand. So the Jeep was invented in 1941, as was Mount Rushmore's final completion. The ballpoint pen went on sale in 1944. The microwave oven was invented in 1945, and Slinky toys also hit the shelves in 1945. Bikinis were introduced in 1946, and Polaroid cameras were invented in 1947. So here's a little introduction to person-centered therapy. So person-centered therapy is a specific approach that requires the client to take an active role in his or her treatment, with the therapist being non-directive and supportive. It shares many concepts and values with the existential perspective. Rogers' basic assumptions are that people are essentially trustworthy and have a vast potential or understanding of themselves in resolving their own problems without direct intervention on the therapist's part. They are also capable of self-directed growth. Rogers revolutionized the field of psychotherapy by proposing a theory that's centered on the client as the primary agent for constructive self-change. Contemporary person-centered therapy is the result of an evolutionary process that continues to remain open to change and refinement. So like I just said, it was an evolutionary process. So there were 4 periods of development within this process. So it first starts off back in the 1940s when it was first founded, and that was known as a non-directive counseling. It provided a powerful and revolutionary alternative to the directive and interpretive approaches to the therapy than what was being practiced at the time. Rogers also published Counseling and Psychotherapy, Newer Concepts in Practice. So the client, rather than the therapist, determined the direction and goals of the therapy, and the therapist's role was to help the client clarify feelings. The style of the non directive therapy was associated with increased understanding, greater self exploration, and improved self concepts. Next, in the 1950s, we upgraded to the client centered therapy. This reflected his emphasis on the client rather than the non directive methods. So basically, it shifted from the clarification of feelings to focus on the client's lived experiences. Next, in the 1950s and 1970s, we go to the research focused on certain necessary and sufficient conditions of the therapy. So, as person centered therapy developed further, this research centered on the core conditions assumed to be both necessary and sufficient for successful therapy, such as the attitude of the therapist, like the therapist being genuine and caring and all that great stuff. Rogers also published On Becoming a Person, which addressed the nature of becoming the self that one truly is. And then lastly, in the 1980s to about 1990s, the main source of successful psychotherapy is the client, and that's kind of what it all came down to, is the client is the most important thing. A considerable expansion to education, couples and families, industries, groups, conflict resolution policies, and the search for world peace. So this is when the therapy or theory officially became known as the person-centered approach. Next, we're going to talk about emotion-focused therapy, or EFT. So this emerged as a person-centered approach that was informed by understanding the role of emotion in human functioning and psychotherapeutic change. Like person-centered therapists, emotion-focused therapists establish a therapeutic relationship based on the core therapeutic conditions. EFT, or emotion-focused therapy, focus on two major tasks. The first is at one end of the spectrum, which is helping clients with too little emotion find and access their emotions. And the second is on the other end, where clients who experience too much emotion, you help them contain all of their emotions. This emphasizes the importance of awareness, acceptance, and understanding the experience of emotion. Also, clients are encouraged to identify, experience, accept, express, explore, transform, and manage their emotions. So basically, the main goal of emotion-focused therapy is to help individuals access and process emotions to construct new ways of being. Abraham Maslow's contributions to humanistic psychology. So Maslow was a pioneer in the development of humanistic psychology and was influential in furthering the understanding of self-actualization individuals. Many of Rogers' ideas, especially on the positive aspects of being human and a functioning person, are influenced by Maslow's basic philosophy, which is the humanistic philosophy. Maslow criticized Freudian psychology because of the quote-unquote sick and dark side of human nature that it focused on. Maslow's emphasis on the healthy side of being human and the emphasis on joy, creativity, and self-fulfillment are part of the person-centered philosophy. The person-centered approach rests on the humanistic philosophy and creates a growth-producing climate. Rogers believes that when this is being lived out, it helps people develop their capacities and stimulates constructive change in others. And to the right, this is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so it just starts off with the physiological needs all the way up to self-actualization. So next we're going to talk about the key concept, which is the view of human nature. So a common theme originating in Rogers' early writing and continuing to permeate in all his works is a basic sense of trust in the client's ability to move forward in a constructive manner if conditions of fostering growth are present. In keeping with the philosophy of humanistic psychology, Rogers firmly maintained that people are trustworthy, resourceful, capable of self-understanding and self-direction, able to make constructive changes, and able to live effective and productive lives. Rogers also decided that 3 therapist attributes create a growth-promoting climate in which individuals can become the best that they can be, the most successful. The first is what's known as congruence or genuineness. So, congruence implies that the therapists are real, that they are genuine, integrated, and authentic during the therapy hour. They are without a false front, their inner experience and outer expression of that experience match, and they can openly express feelings, thoughts, reactions, and attitudes that are present in the relationship with the client. Rogers' concept of congruence does not imply that only a fully self actualized therapist can be effective in counseling. Because therapists are human, they cannot be expected to be fully authentic 24/7. That's impossible. Congruence exists on a continuum from highly congruent to very incongruent. The second is unconditional positive self regard, or acceptance and caring. This can be best achieved through empathetic identification with the client. The caring is non possessive and is not contaminated by evaluation or judgment of the client's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors as good or bad. It is not an attitude of, I'll accept you when, but rather it is an attitude of, I'll accept you as you are. Therapists communicate through their behavior that they value their client as they are and that clients are free to have feelings and experiences. And lastly, we talk about accurate empathetic understanding. So, first, empathy is defined as a deep and subjective understanding of the client with the client. So, accurate empathetic understanding is when the therapist strives to sense client's subjective experience, particularly in the here and now. The aim is to encourage clients to get closer to themselves, to feel more deeply and intensely, and to recognize and resolve the strangeness that exists within them. Rogers asserts that when therapists can grasp the client's private world as the client and sees what it feels like without losing the separateness of their own identity, constructive change will begin. Actualizing tendency is a directional process of striving toward realization, fulfillment, autonomy, and self-determination. So this is a natural inclination of humans and is based on Maslow's studies of self-actualization. It actualizes people, and it has a significant implication for the practice of therapy. The person-centered approach rejects the role of the therapist as the authority who knows best and of the passive client who depends on the therapist's expertise. Therapy is rooted in the client's capacity for awareness and self-directed change in attitudes and behavior. The person-centered approach emphasizes clients' abilities to engage in their own resources and to act in their own world with others. So next, we're going to talk about the therapeutic process. So first are the therapeutic goals. So Rogers did not believe that the goal of therapy was merely to solve problems. Rather, the goal is to assist clients in achieving a greater degree of independence and integration so they can better cope with problems as they identify them. Next, clients come to recognize that they have lost contact with themselves by using facades. In a climate of safety, in this therapeutic session, they also come to realize that they are more authentic. There are a lot more authentic ways of being. So, kind of an example would be that a college student might see themselves as a future physician, but the grades might not be reflecting that. They might be getting below average grades, so getting into medical schools probably very unlikely. So the discrepancy there would be between how this college student sees themselves, which is their self-concept, or how the college student would like to view themselves, which is the ideal self-concept. And the reality of the poor academic performance may result in anxiety and personal vulnerability, which would later result in probably going to therapy. In order to change, according to Rogers, the college student has to know that this problem actually exists and is wanting the change. The therapist does not choose specific goals for the clients, and I think that's very, very important and very reiterated within this theory as a whole. That the cornerstone of this person-centered theory is that the view that clients in a relationship with a facilitating therapist have the capacity to define and clarify their own goals. Therapists focus on the how and not the what. So they focus on more how can we get better, how can we do this, not what is wrong with you. So next we're going to talk about the therapist's function and role. So the role of person-centered therapists is rooted in their ways of being and attitudes, not in the techniques designed to get the client to do something. Therapists use themselves as an instrument of change by encouraging clients on a person-to-person level. Person-centered therapy holds that the therapist's function is to be present and accessible to clients and focus on their immediate experience. Instead of viewing clients in preconceived diagnostic categories, the therapist meets them on a moment-to-moment basis and enters their world. Next, we're going to talk about client's experience. So clients come to the counselor in a state of incongruence, or a discrepancy happens between their self-perception and their experience in reality, which, as I mentioned earlier, with that example of the discrepancy. The person-centered framework shows clients that they can be reasonable for themselves in the relationship and that they can learn to be more free by using the relationship to gain greater self-understanding. They can express their fears, anxiety, guilt, shame, hatred, etc., and incorporate into their self-structure. Person-centered therapy is grounded on the assumption that clients create their own self-growth and are active self-healers. Now we're going to talk about the relationship between the client and the therapist. So this provides a supportive structure within which clients' self-healing capacities are activated. Rogers said, "If I can provide a certain type of relationship, the other person will discover within him or herself the capacity to use that relationship for growth and change, and personal development will occur." From Rogers' perspective, the client-therapist relationship is characterized by equality. As clients experience the therapist learning in an accepting way to them, they will learn how to listen acceptingly to themselves. Core therapist conditions have emerged by many therapeutic schools as an essential in facilitating therapeutic change. Next, we're going to talk about the application. So, one of Rogers' main contributions to the counseling field is the notion that the quality of the therapeutic relationship, as opposed to administering techniques, is the primary agent of growth in the client. The therapist's ability to establish a strong connection with the client is the critical factor determining successful outcomes. The therapist's presence, or being completely attentive to and immerse the client as well as the client's expressed concerns, is very important. Immediacy, which is addressing what is going on between the client and therapist, is highly valued in this approach. Person-centered therapists genuinely do not find traditional assessment and diagnosis to be useful because these procedures encourage an external and expert perspective on the client. What matters the most is the way the client self-assesses, not how the counselor assesses the client. Rogers saw therapy as co-assessment, whereby the therapist and the client engage in a continuous process of self-understanding. The person-centered approach demands a great deal of the therapist. An effective person-centered therapist must be a great, astute listener who is grounded, centered, genuine, respectful, caring, present, focused, patient, and accepting in a way that involves maturity. Natalie Rogers points out that the person-centered approach is a way of being that is easy to understand intellectually, but it's also very difficult to put into practice. So that leads us into our person-centered expressive arts therapy by Natalie Rogers. So Natalie Rogers expanded on her father's theory of creativity using the expressive arts to enhance personal growth for individuals and groups. Her approach, known as the expressive arts therapy, extends the person-centered approach to spontaneous creative expression, which symbolizes deep and sometimes inaccessible feelings and emotional states. Expressive arts therapy uses various artistic forms, which are, I mentioned before, but movement, drawing, painting, sculpting, music, writing, and improvisation. And it's toward the end of growth, healing, and self-discovery. Multi-modal approach integrating mind, body, emotions, and inner spiritual resources. Methods of expressive arts therapy are based on humanistic principles, but give fuller forms to Carl Rogers' notions of creativity. Her approach is based on a person-centered theory of individual and group processes, the same condition that Carl Rogers and his colleagues found basic to fostering a facilitative client-counselor relationship also helps support creativity. This deep faith in the individual's innate drive to become fully oneself is basic to the work in person-centered expressive arts. Person-centered expressive arts utilizes the arts for spontaneous creative expression that symbolizes deep and sometimes inaccessible feelings and emotional states. Motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is a humanistic, client-centered, psychosocial, and modestly directive counseling approach developed by William R. Miller and Stephen Rollnick in the 1980s. The clinical and research applications of this evidence-based practice have received increased attention in the recent years and has been shown to be effective as a relatively brief intervention. Based on the humanistic principles, many basic similarities with person-centered therapy has expanded with the traditional person-centered approach. Initially designed as a brief intervention for problem drinking, but more recently this approach has been applied to a wide range of clinical problems, including substance abuse, compulsive gambling, eating disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, suicide, chronic disease management, and health behavior change practices. Both motivational interviewing, or MI, and person-centered practitioners believe in the client's ability, strengths, resources, and competencies. Underlying assumptions is that clients want to be healthy and that they desire a positive change. So here are the stages of change. There are 5 of them. And this model assumes that people progress through a series of 5 changes, but not necessarily in this order, and they don't necessarily have to go through every single one. So first is the pre-contemplation stage. So basically there's no intention of changing, and that they might not even realize that there's a problem to begin with. The contemplation stage are when people are aware that there's a problem and are considering overcoming it, but they do not yet have that commitment to taking the action to change it. The preparation stage are when individuals intend to take the action immediately and report some small behavioral changes. The action stage is individuals are taking steps to modify their behavior to solve their problems. The maintenance stage is when people work to consolidate their gains in prevalent relapse. Motivational interviewing is but one example of how therapeutic strategies have been developed based on the foundational principles and philosophy of the person-centered approach. Person-centered therapy from the multicultural perspective. So here are some strengths. It has impacted the field of human relations with diverse cultural groups. Person-centered philosophy and practice can now be studied in several European countries, South America, and Japan. It's made a global impact, which is amazing. Rogers' work reached more than 30 countries, and his writings have been translated into 12 languages. Underlying philosophy of person-centered therapy is grounded on the importance of hearing the deeper messages of a client. Empathy, being present, and respecting the values of the clients are essential attitudes and skills in counseling cultural diverse clients. Several writers consider person-centered therapy as being ideally suited to clients in a diverse world. It is particularly appropriate for working with diverse client populations because the counselor does not assume the role of expert who is going to impose a quote-unquote right way of being on the client. And here are some shortcomings. Many clients who come to community mental health clinics or who are involved in outpatient treatments want more structure than this approach provides. It is difficult to translate the core therapeutic condition into actual practice in certain cultures. Communication must be consistent with the client's cultural framework. In applying the person-centered approach with clients from diverse cultures pertains to the fact that this approach extols the value of an internal locus of evaluation. So we're going to do a little quiz to see how well you guys paid attention during this whole presentation. So the first question is, what year did the microwave get invented? Was it 1945, 1941, or 1946? Yay, I'm sure you got it right. If you guessed 1945, you got it right. Number 2, who is the founder of person-centered counseling? Was it Carl Rogers, Natalie Rogers, or William R. Miller? If you answered Carl Rogers, then you get an A+. Number 3, what is Carl Rogers' middle name? Ransom, Random, or Roger? If you answered Ransom, awesome job. You are correct. 4, what does EFT stand for? Emotion-focused talking, emotion-focused therapy, or emotion-focused tomatoes? If you answered B, emotion-focused therapy, then you are correct. And last but not least, do you think you are going out to date with this theory? Now, I obviously cannot answer that for you. However, I think after researching this theory and learning all about it, I definitely want to take this theory out on a date. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.